Top boxing news. Ow!
Okay, we'll start with this. Well, initial reports seem to indicate that the Jake Paul versus Tyron Woodley rematch bombed on cable and satellite pay-per-view. Numbers are below November's AEW Full Gear, which did under 65,000 buys on terrestrial TV. Streaming numbers are unknown. And this news doesn't come as a surprise to me because the Jake Paul versus Tyron Woodley rematch was an impromptu rematch. Tyron Woodley decided to step in for Tommy Fury, who had to pull out of the fight. That's who Jake Paul was initially supposed to be locking horns with. I don't know that Tommy Fury, being a British import, would have generated more buzz, more attention towards Jake Paul's next pay-per-view endeavor.
I don't know with any certainty that the Tommy Fury fight would have did any better.
In hindsight, I really don't know that that fight would have performed any better than this one on pay-per-view because Tommy Fury is a British import, after all. Most Americans aren't familiar with him.
Can't say the promotion for that fight went above and beyond.
Didn't really have the big fight feel, as it were. The big fight feel to where the audience has to see this because something spectacular might happen. It really didn't. Tommy Fury, he ends up pulling out of the fight. Something's wrong with his chest, an infection. Tyron Woodley stands in on short notice in his place, and that's not appealing.
Because people already saw Jake Paul box Tyron Woodley.
And you want to pay attention to that because a lot of people bought that pay-per-view. That pay-per-view performed a lot better than this one, and on that pay-per-view, people saw Jake Paul box Tyron Woodley, and it wasn't entertaining. It didn't end in a knockout. Thus, it didn't lend itself to a potential rematch. A rematch which ended up happening, but a rematch that wasn't built up.
Because this wasn't the guy he was supposed to be fighting.
Jake Paul's audience isn't your seasoned fight fan, you understand. Boxing fans, boxing guys like me and you, aren't who Jake Paul appeals to, who he caters to with these novelty fights that he's having.
He's got more of a teen and tween audience.
A teen and tween audience with the attention span of the common housefly. I mean, that first fight wasn't nothing to write home about. It really wasn't all that entertaining. How many people do you think really want to see Jake Paul waltz with a guy and fight behind a jack? That first fight didn't end in a knockout. And post-fight, I talked about that and how Jake Paul's novelty act, his novelty boxing matches, they have to deliver something that...
It's already a deviation from the norm.
They want to see Jake knock a guy out and get knocked out in the process.
Nobody wants to see him waltz with a guy and go the distance.
And that first Tyron Woodley fight, that's what that was. Now, the second fight, the rematch, in spite of underperforming on pay-per-view, the second fight ended the way that the first fight should have. And if that first fight would have ended the way that the second fight did, well, that would have lended itself towards Jake Paul's marquee value. His marquee value that appears to have taken a hit because this pay-per-view had underperformed. It didn't sell 100,000.
It bombed on cable and satellite pay-per-view.
Jake Paul's knockout of Tyron Woodley did happen to go viral. I mean, a lot of people didn't buy the fight, but a lot of people were talking about that knockout by way of social media. So that's the silver lining for Jake Paul and his next endeavor, whatever endeavor that might be, whoever it comes against. That's the light at the end of the tunnel for Jake. Jake, who is now saying that he's going to take a 7 or 8 month break from boxing to help promote the Katie Taylor versus Amanda Serrano fight. You have to wonder if he's not deciding to take this hiatus now because these are his lowest recorded pay-per-view numbers.
He needs interesting dance partners.
There were some preliminary reports of a potential Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. fight. Seemed like strange bedfellows to me when I first heard the news, and I wasn't completely sure that that fight would come off. If that fight is going to come off, I can only assume that it'll be 7 or 8 months from now, once this hiatus ends.
Does this mean the circus is leaving town?
Does this herald the end of Jake Paul's novelty act and his tour in the world of boxing? No, not necessarily, but his next opponent has to be someone interesting, has to be someone that the American populace, the American fans...
He can keep trolling UFC fighters that are under contract,
but he won't get a fight with one of them, Jorge Masvidal or somebody else, because they're under contract.
Well, granted, he could sell a lot more pay-per-views with those guys, but he can't fight those guys.
Because those guys are under contract. For this novelty act to continue, Jake Paul is going to need interesting opponents, and there aren't that many interesting opponent options.
He's a novice boxer at best, and they're a journeyman that might starch this guy.
So he has to tread carefully. Whoever he picks, whoever he chooses, they have to be known, well known enough that it will get people's attention.
There has to be some intrigue, some sizzle.
Someone who's known, definitely someone who's known, someone who's capable to some degree, but not so capable that Jake may be in over his head, that he may be biting off more than he can chew. It's going to be interesting to see what happens, but we won't see what happens for the next 8 months. Just in keeping with the theme of novelty acts gone wrong, the other Paul, Logan Paul, claims corny weasel Floyd Mayweather still hasn't paid him for their fight. With the bout not being scored, Paul walked away with the bragging rights after going the distance, with reports suggesting he walked away with just short of $4 million. However, the 26-year-old has hinted that all is not right with his earnings, calling out Mayweather on Instagram shortly after hinting his boxing career was over. He wrote, "Pay me my fucking money, you corny weasel of a human," at Floyd Mayweather. Mayweather, who is the highest grossing boxer in pay-per-view history, said that he was looking to walk away with around $72 million from the bout, with Paul's earnings an estimated $3.91 million.
That number seems exaggerated to me.
You heard what I said. Did Floyd Mayweather Jr. actually walk away with $72 million or in excess of $72 million for that god-awful exhibition match with Logan Paul? The entire endeavor in and of itself was cringeworthy. Initially, it wasn't going to be on Showtime. It was going to be on Fanmio, and reports indicated that due to a lack of interest, the event...
Remember, initially there was premium pricing.
Showtime wasn't involved. Showtime wasn't the platform that was going to feature the fight. Initially, it was going to be on some platform called Fanmio, and they moved it off of Fanmio. The fight ended up getting postponed due to what was a reported lack of interest.
So Showtime gets involved, and all of a sudden it's more interesting?
I question that. The pay-per-view was reported to have generated something in the neighborhood of 1 million pay-per-view buys at a price point of $49.99. That's $49.99 in US dollars.
49 times a million is 49 million.
Whereas Floyd said he stood to make something like $72 million from the exhibition match. I find that a little hard to conjure when $49 million, out of that $49 million that this pay-per-view supposedly generated, half goes to the cable and satellite companies.
It's conceivable he could have made more money off sponsorships.
So with the cable and satellite companies taking half of whatever comes in, that 49 turns into roughly 24 million.
That 24 turns into 21 because Jake supposedly got 3.
Leaving Floyd Mayweather Jr. with the rest. Are we to believe that Floyd Mayweather Jr. made 51 million in sponsorships, coupled with the 21 million from the pay-per-view? Are we to believe that this guy made more off sponsorships?
Because that's the difference if he claims he's walking away with 72 million.
21 million from the pay-per-view and another 51 from sponsorships?
For a fight that got moved off Fanmio due to a lack of fan interest.
I'll tell you right now, I've suspected that things aren't as they appear. Things aren't as they seem when it comes to Floyd Mayweather Jr. and his finances as soon as I saw that he was going to be swapping punches with a YouTuber, of all things. It's just not in keeping with what someone would do with their own time.
Wasn't 50 Cent saying that this guy's broke?
What was it, a year, 2 years ago? 50 Cent went on to say publicly that Floyd, his old buddy Floyd, the overhead of his decadent lifestyle had finally caught up to him and the money was gone. It was right around the time you saw Floyd travel to Japan to participate in some kind of crossover match with a kickboxer, Tenshin Nasukawa.
That seemed pretty fucking strange.
Though not as strange as trying to box Logan Paul in an exhibition match featured on Fanmio.
Which later on ended up being Showtime.
And now what we're hearing is that Logan Paul sounds like he didn't get all his money.
You know, there's been a lot of this going around.
Jermall Charlo's debit card being declined at a diner where he attempted to dine and dash. Gervonta Davis being in the hole something like $20,000, $40,000 at some car dealership. Adrian Broner, he's crying broke. He's urging Al Heyman to give him all of his money by way of social media. And what's the common denominator? All of these guys. Al Heyman.
He's the common denominator.
He deals with all of these guys. He's got a hand in all of their careers. The career of Floyd Mayweather Jr., Jermall Charlo, Gervonta Davis, Adrian Broner. He's the common denominator. Right before
the Davis versus Cruz pay-per-view,
Floyd Mayweather Jr. himself took to social media urging the fight fans not to steal the fight, to do the right thing and pay for it. Do the right thing coming from Floyd Mayweather Jr., of all people.
The guy likening the Logan Paul fight to a bank robbery.
The guy who reports indicate seems to have stiffed Logan Paul, not paid him all his monies. Do the right thing coming from Floyd, of all people.
He was telling people to do the right thing and buy the fight.
Now listen, piracy is a problem. It has been for years. But you tell me, when have you ever seen Floyd Mayweather Jr. take to social media to urge people not to steal one of his fights or one of his fighters' fights? When do you ever recall hearing Floyd Mayweather Jr. urging people to do the right thing?
Something's going on over there, and I don't know what it is.
But I get the sense that all of these guys are pulling from the same well, and the well is running dry.
Jim Charlo's credit card gets declined.
Gervonta Davis is in the hole 40 G's. Adrian Broner, he's always in the hole. He's always crying broke, going as far as saying he's willing to fight under the Matchroom banner over there on DAZN. And now what we're hearing is that Floyd Mayweather Jr. owes Logan Paul some money. Floyd money Mayweather.
Floyd was begging people not to steal Gervonta's fight.
And look at the timing of all of these separate events, what appear to be separate situations involving different people, and I just get the sense that they're all pulling from the same well, and that well is running dry, because the common denominator between them is Al Heyman.
The guy who just gave Canelo Alvarez $40 million up front for a Caleb Plant fight.
The guy who Floyd Mayweather Jr. has seemed pretty upset with as of late, regularly mentioning him, though I don't know why.
You think all this stuff might be related?
I think that a guy like Floyd Mayweather Jr., who's always boasting about how much money he's got, how much money he makes, shouldn't have a YouTuber dragging his name through the mud due to
some money that Floyd owes him. That's what I think.
And finally, it appears that former unified heavyweight champion Andy Ruiz is very much receptive to a fight with Tyson Fury. He's very much receptive to standing in for Dillian Whyte, given the negotiation issues that he's experiencing with Tyson Fury. He says, "Vamos con todo para el WBC."
I wouldn't dismiss Andy Ruiz as a genuine possibility for Tyson Fury's next fight.
Though Robert Helenius is also in the running, and comparatively, Robert Helenius is a cheaper alternative to Dillian Whyte, a cheaper alternative to Andy Ruiz.
The Helenius fight would go down in the UK in Manchester.
Whereas the Ruiz fight, that would be in Las Vegas, Nevada, here stateside. I have to say, comparatively, a Ruiz fight is a hotter ticket than a Robert Helenius fight, though neither of those tickets is as hot a ticket as Dillian Whyte would have been in the United Kingdom. There's more in it for the fight fans.
The Ruiz fight ain't been built up as long as the Whyte fight.
The Ruiz fight isn't a domestic rivalry the same way that the Whyte fight is, between two homegrown talents, two homegrown fighters from the same soil. It's really not the same thing, and I do question as to whether or not Fury versus Andy Ruiz can yield the same result, generate the same kind of revenue that the Wilder trilogy generated.
How interested are the Americans in this fight?
They didn't seem all that interested in Andy's last fight, that Chris Arreola fight that he had on pay-per-view. The numbers for that fight were abysmal.
Though I do think this fight could do better commercially.
Fury versus Ruiz is a hotter ticket than Ruiz versus Arreola. I think that goes without saying, though the question here is Fury versus Ruiz a hotter ticket in America than Fury versus Whyte is in the United Kingdom?
And what's Andy Ruiz going to want for that fight?
Andy Ruiz, who was reported to have been offered something like $4 million last year for a Dillian Whyte fight. $4 million that he turned down to do absolutely nothing the entirety of 2020. He comes back in 2021 against Chris Arreola for a Tyson Fury fight.
How much money is he going to want for that fight?
$4 million up front wasn't enough to get him in the ring with Dillian Whyte. So how much money is it going to take to get him in the ring with Tyson Fury? Comes to Tyson Fury and his handlers, what are they willing to offer Andy? Are they going to offer Andy what they just offered Dillian Whyte?
$5.5 million and 25% of the pay-per-view upside.
Andy Ruiz seems receptive to the fight. At first glance he does, but he brought up the WBC title, and I don't know if Andy realizes if he takes Tyson Fury up on this offer, assuming there even is one, a real one. If he decides to fight Tyson Fury next year, it won't be for the WBC title.
Ruiz said, "Let's go, I need that WBC."
And he tagged the WBC's president, Mauricio Suleiman, but I don't think Andy realizes, per reports, the WBC title's not set to be on the line in Tyson Fury's next fight. That's what the reports state. The WBC title's all tied up and entangled in that situation between Dillian Whyte, the WBC, and Tyson Fury. So if Tyson Fury gets out there without Dillian Whyte, per reports, that green belt ain't going to be on the line. You have to wonder if that will affect Andy's enthusiasm. That coupled with whatever they decide to offer him, because it's not a guarantee they offer Andy as a voluntary.
Is he even a voluntary? There's no WBC title on the line.
There's no guarantee that they offer Andy what they just offered Dillian, because this isn't a WBC-sanctioned fight.
It's not actually a voluntary title defense because it's not a title defense.
Not a WBC title defense anyway, so there's no WBC title for Andy to win. Only Tyson Fury's Ring Magazine belt and his lineal status, whatever that means to Andy, and whatever dollar amount they decide to offer him. And are they going to offer him what they just offered Dillian? Will that be enough to get Andy in the ring? These are legitimate questions.
I favor Tyson Fury to win the fight if they can get it over the line.
Stylistically, he has the advantage, the height advantage, the reach advantage, the movement, the speed.
Styles make fights.
And Andy ain't got the style for this fight. Andy Ruiz don't win this fight if they can get this fight over the line. Andy Ruiz, who was dropped by Chris Arreola in his last outing, in his last fight. You have to wonder if they can get this fight over the line. Will Tyson Fury attempt to stop Andy Ruiz where Anthony Joshua did not? Because that's the selling point. That is the appeal, after all. If not for the Joshua fight...
If not for that, most people wouldn't know who Andy is.
And if not for that, this wouldn't be as hot a ticket. There wouldn't be much reason to fight Andy Ruiz and choose him over Dillian Whyte. The alternative, Robert Helenius in Manchester. I mean, what are people going to say? What are people going to say if Tyson Fury ends up swerving Dillian Whyte to fight a guy that Dillian Whyte beat years ago?
That'll be a public relations nightmare.
Tyson Fury's fans, his fanatics, are having a hard enough time trying to explain away Tyson Fury's offer to Dillian Whyte, who in the last 3 or 4 years has sold more pay-per-views in the UK than Tyson Fury has. Tyson Fury and his handlers, who offered Dillian Whyte roughly the same amount of money he's already making.
Without Tyson Fury.
$5.5 million up front. That's roughly what he made with Alexander Povetkin.
25% of the pay-per-view the last 3 years. He's sold more pay-per-views in the UK than you have.
I'm not telling you that Tyson Fury can't draw in the UK. What I'm telling you is that can't be Tyson Fury's offer to Dillian Whyte if Tyson Fury is serious about doing the fight.
Tyson Fury hasn't fought in the UK in 3 years.
In the last 3 years, Dillian Whyte sold out more times in the UK than Tyson Fury has.